And so you can see that there are many discriminatory actions that are continued because of self-interest, and that it actually it beats education. That this self-interest basically outweighs this whatever education can do. And so, because racist ideas were developed to justify these different discriminatory actions, what we see as symptoms are actually hate and ignorance. That these are actually the symptoms, is what Kendi is saying, not the causes of discrimination. Because we've had these discriminatory actions that were created, the systems that were created to perpetually help one class of people while keeping other classes of people down, basically inferior. This is where we get these kinds of symptoms of hate and ignorance and suspicion of one another. And so prejudice became less overt in the late 1900s, before, well, even today probably. This is like what I was saying, that it's all kind of underlying society. It's not as overt as, you are black, therefore you must be a slave, and we don't have to pay you. But instead, what we have is this sort of culture of law and order where police officers have this power, and you're supposed to obey this militaristic police force. Things like the war on drugs was very big in the 1980s and 1990s, or this whole stance on tough on crime. This whole idea of urban neighborhoods and urban poverty was sort of code words for black neighborhoods or ghettos or what have you. But instead of using those words, instead of using the racist, outright, explicit terminology, they would say an urban youth or an urban problem or, what have you. So this war on drugs was seen as specifically an urban problem, yet there were many, many very wealthy white executives, the kids of these people who were using cocaine all the time, and they would consistently get much lighter sentences if they would get sentenced at all, whereas a poor black person who was caught with a small amount of crack cocaine, which was the much cheaper version, would get thrown into prison for 20, 30, sometimes longer than that. So there is a very disparate way that this tough on crime was being enforced against certain people and allowing other people to continue to escape. So these assimilationalists are complicit in racism's endurance and evolution. What that means is that if you do not acknowledge the problem, if you do not want to talk about and recognize the problem, then you are part of this assimilationist population that is just helping to perpetuate the system as we know it. So this uplift suasion is a term that Kendi uses, talking about this notion that whites could be persuaded away from racist views if only they saw black people working to lift themselves up from their lowly station. This is kind of where you get this thinking and this concept of lift yourself up by your bootstraps. Have you heard that? It's a common American term that mostly used by assimilationists, I should say, where they feel that if people, this is people who are working hard to lift themselves up from their lowly station, so they're taking any job they can. They are, not blaming anything on racism. They're just putting their heads down and working to get ahead. Then some white people say, oh, look at, so-and-so is working so hard, and they are like a credit to their race, right? They are not like other people who they view as reliant on welfare, or handouts is another common term that you'll hear. So this is this notion that the people that recognize those who are lifting themselves up are not considered racist because they are giving credit to these people who are working hard. But what that means is that the task of ending white racism falls to black people to continue to try to show, oh yes, we are working so hard and we are trying to be our best American people that we can, to earn that respect of the white people. So he's saying that that is a problem. So while negative portrayals of blacks reinforce racist views, positive ones don't really weaken them. And instead of saying, well, there's all these examples of these hardworking black people, so they must be okay and they must be equal to us, they are now, instead of saying that, they are referred to as these extraordinary Negroes, meaning that they are, like I said, like you're a credit to your race, or you're very special because of what you have been doing for your family or what have you. And so, examples, this is no longer relevant because now Bill Cosby is in prison, right? But when the Cosby Show first came out, it was kind of a breakthrough phenomenon in showing a professional black family on TV, whereas always before then, the only black people you saw on TV were usually poor, or they were kind of caricatures of what white people thought black people were like and how they acted. The Obamas are another example of this quote-unquote extraordinary Negro, because they are also a very professional, very clean-looking black family that has, very high standards, and so that they're seen as these extraordinary examples, rather than just, black people who are working hard and doing everything that white professionals do at the same time. Okay, so what does it take to not be racist, according to Kendi? He talks about this concept of intersectionality, which is what it says here. In order to be truly anti-racist, we must also oppose all the isms: the sexism, homophobia, colorism, ethnocentrism, nativism, cultural prejudice, and class bias, teaming with racism to harm many black lives. And so this can go for not just black people, but any people of color, really, in this country. So he's saying that racism is on par with all of these other things. Sexism, so any kind of views that men and women are different, inferior, what have you, one's inferior to the other. Homophobia, same thing, again, any kind of discrimination against people whose sexual preferences are different than ours. Colorism, ethnocentrism, nativism, all of these things are problems. And if you recognize one, is what he's saying, you have to recognize all of them as problems in our society. And so it's not to say that only white people are guilty of racism, because we are all guilty of racism and prejudice because we are born and bred into this society. So many of us are unwittingly harboring prejudice, and himself included. And he's saying that in his case, he said, I did not fully realize that the only thing wrong with black people is that we think something is wrong with black people. So this goes back to this whole concept of being surrounded by this system that automatically, not automatically, but from a very young age, people are imbued with this notion that to be black is somehow inferior. And that just gets reinforced in many, many steps along the way. Did you know recently California, just like last month or something, really very recently passed a law that black women cannot be discriminated against for wearing their hair in a natural way? Did you hear this? I was like, I can't believe there was a law that said they had to have their hair in a certain style or what have you. You can't just wear your hair in your natural, curls the way that black hair grows. You are not allowed to do that, apparently, according to California, the state of California, up until like last month. That's crazy. I can't believe that. So even that is a very simple but profound example of how this discrimination is deeply woven into our society and in all aspects that affects I didn't know it because I don't have hair like that, right? So it didn't affect me. So in a way, I'm privileged, right? Because I didn't have to deal with that. But if I had a child who had hair like that, then I'm sure I would be aware of it and know. But yeah, see, these things, a lot of us don't know. And then when black people or the people who are affected by it say something or complain, then people just think that they're whining about something. But in reality, it really affects their day-to-day life, and it's something that they are reminded of and have to constantly be aware of every day. Okay, so this is another article in your SkyPack, Separate but Equal, and I don't know how to say this name, Guyat, maybe? And this, they look at this 1896 Supreme Court case, and this is a landmark case, Plessy versus Ferguson. And this landmark case says that the races are separate but equal, right? This is kind of where these early, I don't know what you call them, the people that promoted integration of the races were saying that the presumption of the eventual separation of the races is what enabled early reformers to be able to reconcile slavery and the promises of the Declaration of Independence. So this is what I'm saying, that the founding fathers were able to say every man is created equal, yet still practice slavery in their daily lives. And so these examples of popular efforts to physically move, separate non-white populations, because they promised to relieve liberal whites from the challenges of integration. And so this whole court case was around trying to say, because we did not have slavery anymore at this time, that yes, black people had equal rights, but yet we needed to separate the races so that we did not have to integrate our society. So it's kind of baby steps along this continuum of recognizing that people are people should be equal. And so this was kind of a major case at the time because it acknowledged, yes, they are people like us, but we are still going to make sure that people stay separate. And so with these kinds of landmark cases, with this kind of history, America still has this instinct for racial separation. It's already in our system, and it's hard to overcome these instincts that we've already been cultured with. So this is kind of examples where you see beating or killing black people, African Americans, who quote unquote end up in the wrong neighborhood, where it's justified because, well, they shouldn't have been there in the first place, or they shouldn't have been out at night. What were they doing, wearing a hooded sweatshirt and reaching into their pocket for Skittles in this gated neighborhood when, in fact, he lived in that neighborhood. I'm talking about Trayvon Martin. Do you remember that? That was several years ago. He was a teenager who was out, and he had a hooded sweatshirt on. It was dark, or getting to be dark. And he was just going to 7-Eleven or something. And this guy who was in kind of the self-appointed neighborhood watch thought he looked suspicious and shot him to death in this neighborhood because it was not the kind of neighborhood that he thought a black teenage boy should be walking around in. And then there's things like, so that's a very obvious example. There's also things like housing discrimination in not even major cities. Every city around the country, you will see very distinct patterns of where the more white people live, and there's concentrations of where black and other brown people live. Even in this city in Fresno, it was very clear that if you were anything other than a wealthier white person, you had to live on the other side of tracks. You know where Chinatown is right now, or like Chuck Chansey, the baseball stadium? You had to live on the west side of that because there's train tracks and you were not able to cross and live on the other side. So Fresno was a very, very segregated, it still is fairly segregated, but back in the day it was very, very clearly segregated by blacks, Mexicans, Asians, even, like I said, certain Europeans who were not considered white, like I think Polish people were out there, Italians. So everybody else, but then the richer white people lived in like the Fig Garden area now of what we have now. That was the very upper class neighborhood. And then struggles against poverty, facing Native